The rain came down in sheets over the Norfolk Naval Base, a steady drumming rhythm on the metal roof of the hangar. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the electric tension of a homecoming. Family and friends clutched wet balloons and handmade signs, their eyes fixed on the large bay doors. Among them, a woman named Elena Rossi stood slightly apart, a quiet island in a sea of anticipation. She held a single, perfect red rose, its petals beaded with moisture. Her posture was relaxed, but her dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, were locked on the doors with an intensity that belied her calm exterior. The roar of engines finally announced their arrival, and soon the doors rolled back to reveal a convoy of hulking tactical vehicles. They were back. The deployment was over. A cheer went up from the crowd as the first of the sailors and naval special warfare operators began to disembark. Families reunited in a flurry of embraces and tears. Elena waited, her gaze scanning the familiar warfighter physiques. She spotted him immediately. Commander J. Cutter Bridges. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who was pure sinew and instinct, a head taller than most, his face a mask of controlled emotion as he searched the crowd. When his eyes found Elena, the mask cracked, and a genuine, weary smile broke through. He strode towards her, not running, but with a purposeful, ground-eating walk that was all his own. He swept her into a powerful hug, lifting her slightly off the ground, the rose getting crushed between them. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, a stark contrast to the months of dust, cordite, and salt. "Hey, Rossi," he murmured, his voice raspy. "Hey yourself, sailor," she whispered back, her arms tight around his neck. For a long moment they just held each other. The world of the hangar, the rain, the other reunions, it all faded away. This was the core of their relationship. Years of it. The long, silent stretches of deployment, the brief, intense periods of leave. They were veterans of a different kind of war, a war against time and distance. Later that evening, the celebrations moved to a popular Navy bar in Norfolk, a gritty, honest place called the Drowning Whale. The wood was dark and scarred, the beer was cold, and the walls were a museum of unit patches, faded photographs, and crossed oars. The place was packed with the returning SEAL team and their extended circle. The initial euphoria of the homecoming had mellowed into the easy, boisterous camaraderie of men and women who lived on the edge. Elena and Jay sat in a corner booth, a small, charmed bubble in the loud room. Jay was on his third beer, the tension of command slowly unwinding from his shoulders. He rested his arm along the back of the booth, his fingers toying with a strand of Elena's dark hair. She was listening to him recount a heavily censored, yet still hilarious, story about a mishap with a goat and a piece of sensitive comms equipment in a foreign port. "And so Mooch here," Jay gestured to a large, shaved-headed operator across the bar, "is trying to negotiate with the farmer using a translation app, and he accidentally offers him $100,000 for the goat instead of an apology." The table nearby erupted in laughter. Elena smiled, a genuine, warm expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She knew these men, not as a girlfriend, but as an individual. She'd been to the cookouts, the memorials, the promotion parties. She knew the names of their wives and kids. She never clung to Jay, never made a scene. She was simply there, solid, unshakable. As the night wore on, the beer continued to flow. Jay got up to get another round and was immediately waylaid at the bar by a group of his teammates. Elena watched him go, her expression serene. A moment later, a shadow fell over their booth. It was Lieutenant Pete Monty Montgomery, Jay's second-in-command. He was a wiry, intense man with a sharp wit and an even sharper tongue, and he was well into his cups. "Elena," he said, his voice a little too loud. "The elusive Elena, hiding in your corner." "Hi, Monty," she said evenly. "Good to have you back." "Good to be back," he slurred, sliding into the seat Jay had just vacated. He leaned in, his breath a potent mix of whiskey and bravado. You know, we were talking, the guys and me, on the ship, coming home. He gestured vaguely towards the bar. And we got to wondering, Cutter's a good man, a damn fine leader, been through hell and back with him. But on shore, he's always with you. Elena raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. Is that a problem, Lieutenant? No, no problem, Monty said, waving a dismissive hand. Just an observation, a topic of conversation. Cutter, he's a legend, an institution. And for the last, 4 years? 5? He comes home to you, a civilian. No drama, no other stories. He took a long pull from his bottle. We were just wondering what your deal was, how you landed him. And more importantly, he leaned in even closer, a conspiratorial grin on his face. What your story is. The guys have a pool going on your body count. He said the last 2 words with a crude, deliberate emphasis, his meaning unmistakable. He was asking in the most vulgar way possible about her sexual history. He was trying to get a rise, to inject some of the locker room bravado into the quiet civilian. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't blush. Her dark eyes held his, completely unreadable. She simply said, My what? You know, Monty pressed, emboldened by her calm. Before Cutter, after, just in general. We're all friends here, just curious about the woman who tamed the beast. Just then, Jay returned, 2 beers in his hands. He saw Monty in his seat, and the look on his face immediately hardened. He set the beers down with a thump. Monty, you're in my seat! Jay's voice was low, a dangerous undercurrent in it. Monty looked up, a shit-eating grin plastered on his face. Just having a chat with your better half, Commander, getting to know her, asking the important questions. He turned back to Elena, emboldened by the audience of a few other teammates who had drifted closer, sensing a show. So, Elena, back to my question. Enlighten us. What's the number? 5? 10? More? He gave a little laugh. Come on, don't be shy. They're just ants, right? A few here, a few there. What's the damage? The group around them went quiet. Jay's knuckles were white on the bottle in his hand. He opened his mouth to shut Monty down, to defend Elena's honor with the full force of his rank and his fist. But before a single sound could escape him, Elena placed a calm, restraining hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it carried the absolute authority of someone who needed no protection. She looked directly at Monty, her gaze calm and clear. She didn't look angry or embarrassed or defensive. She looked at him as if he were a fascinating but slightly simple specimen. Ants? She repeated, her voice soft, carrying perfectly in the sudden hush. She tilted her head, a small, almost pitying smile touching her lips. You think my life, my history, is something you can count on your fingers? Like notches on a belt? Monty's grin faltered just for a second. He wasn't getting the reaction he'd expected. No, Lieutenant, Elena continued, her voice still calm, but now with an edge that cut through the bar noise like a scalpel. You're right about one thing. They're not mountains. They're not heroes. To you, maybe they are. But to me, she paused, letting the silence stretch. To me, they're not ants. They were men, 37 of them. The number hung in the air, stark and final, 37. A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Jay stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. Monty just blinked, his drunken brain struggling to process. The crude humor was gone, replaced by a creeping, cold dread. And you want to know what their crime was? Elena asked, her voice dropping even lower, forcing them all to lean in. She looked around at the faces of the hardened SEALs, men who had stared down death without flinching. She held their gaze one by one. Their only crime was being born in the wrong country. Their only mistake was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. A palpable shift went through the group. The air grew thick. Someone shifted uncomfortably. I didn't count them for a bet, she said, her voice now laced with a quiet, devastating weariness. I counted them because it was my job. Because their names, their faces, their final moments, they have to be remembered. Because every single one of them is a file I closed, a case I solved, a family I had to notify. The weight of her words descended on them. The crude, misogynistic question about her body count had just been reframed into something monstrously different. This wasn't a girlfriend. This wasn't just a civilian. They were looking into the eyes of someone who dealt with death not as an abstraction, but as a daily reality. "I'm a forensic pathologist for the International Criminal Court," she stated, her tone matter of fact, "specializing in mass graves and war crimes." She let that sink in. The silence in their corner of the bar was absolute, a stark contrast to the noise from the rest of the room. "Before I moved to the ICC, I spent 3 years with the UN in Bosnia, excavating and identifying victims of the Srebrenica massacre. That was over 8,000 men and boys. But the 37 I mentioned, those are from my last 2 years. A special tribunal, a warlord in Central Africa. I testified at his trial. He was convicted largely on the evidence I gathered from those 37 bodies." She looked back at Monty, who seemed to have shrunk in his seat. "So, when you ask about my body count, Lieutenant, I have to be precise. Because for me, it's not a joke. It's not a number. It's a sacred duty." The silence was deafening. The entire team was speechless. The crude innuendo, the locker room banter, had been obliterated by the sheer, unassailable weight of her reality. They dealt in death as warriors. She dealt in death as a witness, an investigator, a voice for the voiceless. They saw the enemy in a split second of a firefight. She saw the aftermath, the systematic, industrial-scale slaughter. Jay finally found his voice. He put his arm around Elena, pulling her close. He didn't look at his teammates with anger, but with a profound, humbling realization. He looked at the woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, and saw the depth of her strength. A different kind of courage than the one he and his men lived by. It was a courage forged not in battle, but in the quiet, horrifying intimacy of death. "She's not just my girlfriend, gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet for her and her alone. "She's the reason we have a job. She's the one who makes sure the monsters we stop are held accountable." He looked at Monty. "I think you owe her an apology." Monty opened and closed his mouth, utterly deflated. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a look of deep, profound shame. I'm so sorry, Elena. I had no idea. I'm an idiot." Elena gave a small, tight nod. "It's all right. You didn't know." But her eyes said it wasn't entirely all right. It was a reminder of a chasm she lived with every day, the gap between the world of normal life and the world of her work. The party atmosphere at the Drowning Whale never really recovered for them. One by one, the other SEALs came by the booth, not to ask questions, but to offer a quiet, respectful nod. They were warriors, and they had just been in the presence of someone whose battlefield was a morgue, whose weapons were a scalpel and a camera, and whose scars were invisible but ran as deep as any combat wound. They had teased the Admiral about his girlfriend, and she had answered them with a truth so vast and so sobering it had rendered them all, for the first time in their lives, completely and utterly speechless. The rain had stopped by the time they left. The air was clean and fresh. They walked to Jay's truck in silence. He opened the door for her, and before she got in, he stopped her, cupping her face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For them. For him. I had no idea that was what they were walking into. I should have... I don't know." She placed a finger on his lips. "Stop. You don't need to apologize for them. You weren't even there, and you're the reason I'm still sane. You're the reason I can come home from those places and remember that life exists, that love exists." He kissed her then, a long, tender kiss that held the promise of everything. He held her like she was the most precious, fragile thing in the world, even though he now knew with absolute certainty that she was the strongest person he had ever met.